So I mentioned that today we're talking about custom code. It's a short chapter, relatively speaking. It's a short chapter. It's only 32 slides altogether, but I think that's offset by the size of the labs this afternoon. So your labs today, just by necessity, since we're talking custom code, and so there's a lot of information in the labs about how to find the correct place in the code to make the changes and that type of thing. It just makes it necessarily long. So your lab this afternoon will probably take you a bit longer than your previous labs. So our learning objectives for today is we're going to talk about the process of adding additional logic to your generated application. We'll talk about these special places in the code that we've referred to 2 or 3 times yesterday at least. It's called points and blocks. These are special places designed in the generated code to give you a place to go in and add some custom logic. So we'll talk about these points and blocks and how to find the best point or the best block to add your custom code to. We've got some hints and helpers to help you with that. We'll also talk about how to revert your changes out of a point or a block. Fortunately, there's a way to do that that makes it easy to find your changes and back out of them if you change your mind. And then we'll talk about code links that you can use to quickly locate the right place to add custom code. We have several different places where you can find these special code links that you can use to pop right into the right spot, the right point in the generated code to add your changes. So we're starting out the chapter with this topic on points and blocks. That's probably the first thing you need to know is that you don't want to go in and just add custom code willy-nilly just anywhere in the generated code that looks appropriate to you. One of the problems with doing that is if you add custom code to a place that's not one of these special reserved areas, it disappears, right? The next time you rebuild your application, the application generator doesn't know or notice that you've made a change unless it's in one of these special points or block areas. So you don't want to just go in and add custom code anywhere. You need to make sure it's in an appropriate point or block. Remember, even the first day, I think, we talked about these special files, these .code files that are used by the application generator to save off any custom code that you've added. Well, it's only saving off custom code that you've added to these special points and blocks. So again, if you add anything outside of that, then it doesn't get saved into these special .code files, and then when the application is rebuilt later, it's not put back into the code. You just lose it, essentially, if it's not in a point or a block. So one quick way to get rid of all your changes, let's say you make a bunch of changes and then you decide that, oh my goodness, that was not what I wanted to do. I want to start all over again. So one thing you can do to get rid of all of that without having to locate each location, each point or block where you've made a change, is just to go out to your source directory and remove these .code files that are associated with the entities that you're trying to back out of your changes for, and then remove the .code files as well as any of the generated files for that entity. And when you do that, the next time you build the application again, it's going to build it without any of your custom code. So that's a nifty trick for cases where you add a bunch of code here and there in different points. Can't really remember everywhere where you've put it, but you want to take it all back, and this is one way to do it. Just remove the code file and then all the generated files and rebuild the project. This is an introduction to some of the point areas in the code. They're calling them point sections, and I'll point some of those out to you in just a minute. But let's go through this introductory topic. Some of the common point sections that you'll see if you're browsing through the code. There's a point in the import area of an application module where you can import additional modules if you need to. And we'll actually be using some of these points in our custom code for tomorrow. So tomorrow, when we get into this notion of adding custom code to create a splash screen for our project, which is kind of a fun exercise tomorrow, we'll be using the special import for that, this import, that's hard to say, import point for that. You can also add comments in the code. There are special points just for you to add comments to document your code better. So later when you come back or some other programmer comes back and looks at the code, you can give them some idea why the changes were made. There's a special point for you to go in and define additional variables. You see that at the modular level as they're talking about here, but you can also see that at a local level inside the individual functions. There are special points so that you can define local variables. There's points where you can even add additional functions themselves. Typically at the bottom of the module or the bottom the bottom of each module, there's typically a special point down at the bottom called user.functions. And those locations are where you add your own functions. And then, of course, you call those functions from various points or block sections in the code. And we'll see some examples of those today as well. So here's referring to block sections. Now we know that there's two different types of designated areas in the code where you can go in and add your own custom logic. Now one of them we said were point sections, and now we're talking about the other type, which are block sections. Block sections are not as popular and they're not recommended as much as point sections. The problem with block sections is that when you make a change to a block in the application, that entire function or that entire block, like in this case on the screen that we're looking at, notice that someone has made a change to a block here for the module containing the main statement block, and the changes that they've made in here weren't that extensive, but when you make a change to a block section, notice that in the .code file, where all the custom code is reserved during the build process, notice that it actually saves off the entire block, right? In this case, the entire main, almost the entire module. So essentially, that means that you are now responsible for all the code in that entire main statement block and everything outside of that that you see here in this special .code file where it's reserved. So that's the problem with block sections. Essentially, you're taking over the responsibility of all the code in the whole block. So if there's an upgrade, for example, where we're using a new template, a set of templates, they might make some changes to the code, but those changes won't get implemented because your user changes, that entire block, will be put back into the code when you build the application. So block sections can be problematical, so they're not recommended. If at all possible, you want to make sure that you add any custom code to a point section instead. And when you make a change to a point, notice that we've got 2 or 3 before and after screenshots here so that you can see how that's handled, or how the application generator keeps track and lets you keep track of the status of a particular point. So at first, before you've made your change, there's really just the name attribute in a point. Like this point is named user.comments, and that's what a point looks like before you've added any custom code. If you make a change to a point, the status is updated like we see in this second screenshot, and it gets a status of modified. So all the modified points are tracked, and when you build the project again, you'll see all your modified points listed in the output view as the output view is populated during the build process. And when you look at your output view after a build, one of the things you can do is you can actually double-click on a modified point entry in the output view, and it will pop you right into the custom code, pop you right back into that point so you can look at the custom code. So that's a handy thing to be able to do. If you're rebuilding the project, you perhaps get some errors associated with some custom code that you put in, that's the quickest way to get right back there to see what the problem might be with your code. I mentioned earlier that there's a handy way to revert or back out of a change with these points as well. Notice here there's a point that's been modified. All you have to do is right-click on that point, and when you right-click you have an option point or block, and then from there there's a revert point or block. So that allows you to back out of a change and put the point back to the way it was before you added your custom code. So notice it even has a new attribute associated with the point entry in the code. So now it's got a name attribute, a status attribute, and now an action attribute. Action equal revert. So once you've gone in and reverted a point or a block, the next time you build your application, it's going to back out of those changes again. So that introduces us to a new topic, finding the right place to customize. So before we get into that topic, let's go ahead and look at some of these examples of points and blocks, just to get a feel for how many of them there are. There's a lot of different points in the code, a lot of places where you're given a chance to add any kind of customization that you want to add. So I don't really have anything particular in mind to show you, so let's just grab, I've got the Pool Doctors app up here, so let's just grab the main. That will be fine for looking at points. So notice here, even in the main, up at the top, we have an area here, a special point, so that you can comment, add some comments. Perhaps if you're making some customized changes to the code, you might mention those up here at the top and point your user in the right direction so he can figure out what changes have been made and why. And then down here is the import point that we were talking about first in that PowerPoint slide we saw on some of the different points that are commonly edited or changed. So here you can see there's been some changes made to this import point here in the main, and we'll actually be talking about these tomorrow, so I'll kind of hold off until tomorrow for that. But there's a point just for importing, like C extension libraries or BDL modules, whatever the case might be. And then down here in the main, we've got some additional points here. There's this point main.init that we've looked at a few times, and we'll probably look at it again today. This is where we've gone in and specified some special custom code so that we could use our own action defaults. So this is a way where you can go in and customize resource files that you want to use instead of the default resource files. And we'll come back to this in just a few minutes. Right now we're just focusing on the points. So that's where I can go in and make some changes to the initialization the initialization process in the program main. See if there's any other ones. Notice this all through the code here. There's special areas where you can add some custom logic. Now this is another area that we talked about yesterday, another section that we talked about yesterday, where the actual generated code goes in and copies our Pool Doctors database to a writable directory on an iOS device. So notice that even in this special generated code to do that, there's areas here in the code where you can define your own special initialization routines. Perhaps you've got additional files that need to be writable, updatable for iOS, and you could add that to one of these special points. This is the special point that's defined for kind of initialization going into that, and then down here is the other special point where you could add your own function, for example, to do it, to do whatever you, or not function, but your own special code to add to the function to do your own initialization routine. And then down here, it's getting to the code there where it's going to call another module, a function in another module to open the first form. So we've got some special points there where you can go in and add some custom code that affects that process, or anything you want to do before the first form is opened could be added to this point here, this point name equal fct.openFirstForm.init. And then finally, we talked about the user functions point, and here it is down at the bottom. So typically, if you're interested in adding an entire function, you'll just be using the very bottom point down at the bottom of the module, whatever that module happens to be. So there's the special points. Now just real quickly, we may have already seen these, but just in case I haven't shown you, pop this up here real quick. These special code files that we're talking about here that save off any custom code that you've added. Here's the Pool Doctors source directory on my machine, and you can see that there's a special code file for each one of your entities. So all these different forms that we have in the Pool Doctors application, each one of those has its own special code file. As we scroll down here, we can see several of them. And each one of those has any custom code. I just popped up this job header grid code file, and everything we see in here is, or not everything, but you can see that there's quite a bit of custom code here for that particular entity. So that's what the .code files look like. So that's all part of the code generation process. Remember, it goes through and looks for any customized code that you've added to points or blocks, and it saves those off to the special .code file for that entity, and then it's plugged back in when the application is regenerated towards the end of the process. All right, so let's go ahead and go back now to the second topic, finding the right place to customize. So there's several different ways and places that you can go to find the right place to add your custom code. Probably the easiest way, and a way that I use quite a bit, is something called code links. So there's direct access with code links. It will lead you to the exact point in the application code, so the right module, the right function, the right point to add custom code for whatever code link that you've specified. And we'll take a look at some of those too as we go through this section. We also have a special code file properties that you can use to find the actual file that you should edit to add some custom code for certain things. So it's not as precise as a code link, but at least it gets you into the correct module, so it gives you a good start. Now, if you can't find a code link or a code file property that applies when you're trying to find the right place to add some custom code, then you go back to the old manual method. Right? So you can look at the code architecture. In the topics we covered yesterday, one of the things we did was walked through the generated code modules and what each one of those modules is responsible for. And that was designed to help you be able to find the right place, or the right module at least, to add custom code to if you need to. In the intermediate file folders in the project view, you can open your modules there and scan through them there. I don't know how much help that is finding the exact right place in the code, but sometimes that's where you have to go to get started. Just open up these different modules and explore them and see if you can find the right place. But again, the architecture should get you started in the right direction for that. And then once you have a module open, when you're looking for a specific function, or let's say even a specific variable that you're interested in or looking to change, use the code structure view in the code editor. And that's also very helpful to show you all the different dependencies for your module. If there's any external dependencies, You can see all the functions, all the variables, and that type of thing. So that can be very helpful, trying to quickly move to or find the right function and the right variable. So here we're talking about these code links. I think these are probably, I'm sure, the handiest way to find the correct place in the code. So just a quick example here for code links. I can use a special code links called display attributes. We'll see this again when we're looking at code links specifically. But right here in the record is what we have highlighted. And then when we highlight the record, it shows us a list of code links that are available at the record level. And I can click on this display attributes code link, and that will pop open the correct module, put me in the right function, and even in the right point. Notice it highlights the right point for me to go in and add any custom code that might be associated with the display array statement. And we'll be using that later today to go in and add some custom code to display array. So that one will be a good one for us to use as an example. Now there's different kinds of code links. The ones we were looking at were at the record level, but notice we've also got code links available for the meta schema. So that's what we're looking at here. So if you select a table in your meta schema diagram, there are code link properties that you can get to at the table level. So notice here in the meta schema they've actually selected, in this case, the job note table. And when you actually select the table, if you look over in the properties on the right-hand side, you can find the code links down toward the bottom. And these are all different points that you can access with these code links to add custom code. So you can find the area in the custom code that has to do with deleting a row, selecting a row, inserting, and so on. And some of them are very specific, before the insert and after the insert. So those are very handy for finding the exact place in the code to look for that functionality. So I can select the table in the meta schema, and over here on the right hand side it's saying there's even a few things available at the column level. Not much. As you can see, the only thing available really is constraints. So if you want to see where the constraint checking for a specific column in the table is done and maybe investigate that or change it, there is the constraints code link that you can use. I'm sure that would be limited use for you, but that's what it's there for. Now here's form code links. This is the one we took the example from at the beginning of this topic, so a bit of an overlap here. But for form code links, we've got the record tab, which is where our example came from. We can select the background of the record tab if we want to access code links for the actual managed form. So this is not the record code links that we were looking at in our first example. This is for the form. So here we are in the screenshot here. They've selected the background for the record, not the record itself, but the background back here. And in the code links available, you see here. So if you wanted to go to the point in the code where it's opening the window and opening the form, you could use that open window code link. There's various places here where you can find like display array information, input information, search, empty mode events, action state, right? So there you can see any kind of generated code, and there are points there where you can add code to go in and disable actions or enable actions. Typically the code generator does all that for us, but there might be cases when you want to do some action management yourself, and that's the code link that you would pick to do that. And then over here we've got record code links. This is where we saw the example earlier. We were looking at this, if I remember, it was the display attributes code link, and that popped us right into the area of code where the display array was was written or generated. So if we had any special display array attributes that we wanted to add to the code, that code link would take us to exactly the right point in the code to do that. But there's a lot of them. Notice for record level code links, we've got, if you want to see where rows are selected and make a change there, we're going to see this computed fields code link here in just a minute or two. We'll be looking at that in more detail. Where deletes are done, lookups, display events, construct, where the user is able to go in and enter search criteria. All of those are available at the record level. And then finally down here, you can actually select a field in the record, not just the record itself, to see field activation code links. So if you want to manipulate at the field level for some reason, you can do that with this special code link. You would just highlight the field in the record that you're interested in working with, and then it would have its own code link for that field activation code link. Again, not as common as the ones you see over here in number 2, right? All of these are more common over here at the record level and the form level over here on the far left. There are a few, and just a few, code links available in the Form tab. All right, so what we've been looking at on the previous page was the Record tab. But if you go into the Form tab and you highlight, well, specifically a combo box, right? The only code link that I can think of off the top of my head for the Form tab is for combo boxes. So there's not very many code links at the form field level, we'll say, or at the form widget level, form field widget level. In fact, the only ones I know of are right here, and that's for combo boxes. You never know though, right? We've got, eventually we'll have newer versions of the template files coming out, so just be aware those are there, because you never know when there might be something new, right? There might be additional code links in the future. So that was the big topic, several pages there about code links. Now we're switching gears just a little to talk about code files. Now we mentioned that code files is not as precise as code links. The idea with code files is to give you access to the right generated code file. But it's not as precise. It doesn't get you down to the function or the point in the code that you need to use to add your customized code. So these are more generalized. So we've got metaschema code files. So here we can select the background of the metaschema diagram. And again, there's not very many code files. In fact, there's only 2. There's data and constraints. And you can see that since we're talking about the metaschema, yesterday when we were going through the architecture, we talked about these 2 modules, schema name underscore DDX data and schema underscore DDX constraints were the 2 modules, the 2 generated modules that are responsible for managing the actual database. So if you go in there, you see the very low level database SQL statements inside those 2 files. So that's where you go if you use these metaschema code files. We also have form code files. Over here on the right-hand side of the slide, we're talking about form code files. And if you go in here and select the background, this area back here of the form record, then you can see some code files here. So again, if you select the UI code file, remember we're not going to a specific point with these, but it will open up the module form name underscore UI.4GL, because that module has to do with interacting with the user. Dialogues opens form UI dialog, because that's where a lot of our dialog management is handled. Dialog data, if you select that code file link, it takes you to the form name underscore UI dialog data.4GL. One thing that's in there are a lot of these publicly defined variables. So when you're looking for variables that you can use when you're customizing your code, that's one of the places I usually pop in there to see what's available. And then if you finally, the data code file, if you select that, it opens form_UI_data.4gl. And you can guess from the names, from that name, that it's responsible for data manipulation when you're interacting with the user. So there's the code files. So not as precise, but still helpful. So let's say that you're looking for a place to add some custom code. You've exhausted your possibilities with code links and code files. You can't figure out which one might get you in the best place. So you've decided to try to just find it manually. So what other help can we get? Well, one thing, ask yourself a series of questions. That's what this is all about, to help you kind of deduct, at least get close to the module that you want to modify. Starting at the top, first think through in terms of, can this be changed, or can I make this change some way in the model with a property or an entity change, something along those lines. And if that's the case, you could study up on our modeling the application topics. So if it's something that could be done in a diagram or be done in a model with a property, that's where you would go to read up on it. Next step down, is this something I could do with an external resource file? Instead of getting in and manipulating things at a low level and adding to points and blocks, is this something I could do with a resource file like an action defaults file? Remember, we can manage things like the images that are shown. It's not a very good idea to change anything to do with images shown for the default action views, remember, because we want those to look like, well, like the Android and iOS standards. So we don't recommend that you do that, but you can go in, at least let's say for your customized actions, and you can go in and change things like the text and the images that are shown with those in a resource file, the action defaults file, instead of trying to add it as custom code. Is the modification database related? If it's database related, we just saw the two files that really get into the low-level database manipulation statements, the SQL there to manage the database. Database constraints with that DVX constraints module, and then the data itself, like manipulating SQL statements to add rows, delete rows to the table in the schema_DVX data module. Is the modification for when the program begins or ends? If it is, the main function in the program.4gl, or the main block in the program.4gl file. So we looked at that as our when we were browsing through looking at the points at the very beginning of the chapter. That's the one we picked, and if you remember, that was our begin and end right there for the entire application, is that main block. So that's a good place to go if you're wanting to add something that, that you want to occur right at the beginning of the app or right at the end. Is the modification related to the interaction with the user? Now this one's a bit tougher because we have several modules related to interacting with the user. We've got Form UI, UI Dialog, UI Dialog Data, and we have UI Data. But again, as we mentioned a page or so ago, you can deduce just from the names of these what they're primarily responsible for. So if it's an interactive dialogue statement and the things that go along with interactive dialogues, you might try this UI Dialog and UI Dialog Data module. If it's anything to do with the form management in the user interface or interaction with the user in the module, then you might look at this Form UI. And then Form UI Data, of course, is responsible for, oh, we saw the other day, doing things like fetching data into records and that type of thing. So anything to do with select statements, building where clauses, that type of thing, you can see some of that here in the form UI and form UI data. If the modification's repeating many times, you might actually consider modifying the template files. Remember, a few times we've talked about it's fully supported. We've provided you even a special template developer guide for you to use to go in and modify and customize the template files. So if you're having to do the same customization over and over with all your different entities, you can actually go in and modify the template set or the template files themselves to make a custom change to the template so that it's generated next time, and you don't have to do that every single time. All right. I was trying to determine whether I should go back and show you some of these code links and code files links now, or whether I should just go ahead and look at these custom code examples, because when we look at the examples, we'll be using those. So I think I'll just go that route. We'll just go ahead and look at these custom code examples, and as we're looking at them, then we'll be seeing some of these special code links and code file links as well. All right, so custom code, when do you use it? There's a lot of different things that you can use custom code for. So this is not an exhaustive list. These are just some possibilities or suggestions, and we're going to show you some of these here in the rest of this topic. One of the things we'll look at, and you have a lab exercise related to, is the ability to compute fields for that two-column display we've talked about in list forms. If you remember, list forms only allow display of 2 columns. So if there's a lot of information that you want to convey to that user in a list form, the way to do that is not to just display, individual columns from the table, because you can only display 2 of them. Instead, what you can do is compute the fields, they call it. Basically, you're concatenating fields together from multiple columns in a table, for example, and displaying them to these 2 areas on the form that supported 2 edit fields, basically. So it's concatenated fields or computed fields, and you can put 2 or 3 columns of information together and then display it in a single column display. So we'll learn how to do that in this section. You might also want to use custom code to configure decoration options for iOS devices. It's a very simple thing to do, so we'll see an example of that. Double click. Remember, double click at the table level that we talked about earlier? I think it was last week. We had a table property in a list form where we could go in and specify this double click property at the table level so that a user could tap, right? He taps on a row to select the row, and that was the double click functionality. So we're going to learn to do that in the custom code because you have a lot more power and control over double click and the functionality if you do it at the display array level, right? That's part of the display array statement. There's an attribute clause that we can use to configure double click. We also can use custom code to row bound an action. If you remember row bound, being able to tie or cause a particular action to be bound to the row. Remember delete, we talked about delete being implicitly row bound, so that a user, if the delete action is available, you don't have to do anything special to configure it. The user just swipes, right, and he'll get the delete option for a row. So that's row bound, being able to swipe to select a row and select the action for it. So we've looked at row bound and double click both once already, but in both cases we were using properties to configure those, and now we're looking at ways to do that in the custom code in cases where maybe the properties don't work quite the way we want them to, or they're not available for them. And then finally, another reason that you might be using custom code is to dynamically handle the user interface. Things like enabling or disabling actions. Now again, generated code takes care of most of that for us. It automatically enables and disables actions depending on where the user is in the application and what actions should be available to the user when they're in a certain place. So all of that is accounted for automatically. It's just the very occasional case where you might want to override the default functionality. Excuse me, I had to sneeze. Okay. So down here, dynamically handling the UI, we have enabling, disabling actions. And again, most of the time, it's all taken care of for us. We don't have to do much of that. You can also hide and show actions if you want to. There's all kinds of things that you can do to manipulate the user interface with custom code, and these are just a few things. You can hide and show just about anything, including actions or even fields on the form. So the first example we're going to take a look at here is this two-column layout for list forms. Now our list form that we've configured in one of our lab exercises, the job note list form, we really didn't need to do any customization to that form to make it look just fine, right? We didn't really need anything special. We didn't want an image to be displayed with our list of notes. We didn't want any additional information to be displayed except just the information about the note. All we wanted were really two columns of information anyway. But you can see here, this is another list form from the Pool Doctors app. And in this list form, oops, let me go back here. In this list form, notice we've got an image that's being displayed. And notice that the image is different depending on the state of the job. This looks like the job header list form. So the image is different depending on the state of the job. So we've got some custom code going on in there to do that. We've got more information than just a single column of information displayed. Up here at the first column, right, here's our first column of information, but it's really, you can tell, a concatenated column because I've got, looks like a name here, and then over here we've got some additional information. So that's more than one column of information there that's been computed or concatenated together to give the user more information. And then down here in our second column of information, we've got computed information here too, right? This didn't come directly from a database column. It has some text. It's got the word job and a colon, and then it looks like the job code here. So again, a computed field, there's some custom code in there to do all that, and then display a lot more than just two columns of information to the two-column list, right? So we've concatenated some fields together to allow us to show the user more information. So how did they go about doing this? This will be one of your exercises this afternoon. Our example for our job note list form that you've been working with is not maybe as interesting as the one they're working with, so this is a good example. So here, notice the first thing they've done is they've added some form-only fields to the record. So that would be, I guess, step number one. Grab my highlighter here. Having a problem grabbing it. So they've added two form-only fields here, major and minor. So major and minor, notice, are defined as edit fields. And they're defined as edit fields because these are going to be displayed. That major field that you see up there at the top is being used to hold the contents of this first column of information, right? So that's what it has in it, is this name, and it looks like a job code over here on the far right. So it's been defined as an edit field so that it can display that value. And in this minor field that you see right below that is another form-only field, and it's not associated with a database column is what that means. And it's also defined as an edit field, and as you can probably guess, its job is going to be to display the second line of information in our list form, right down here. So the major is up here at the top. You can see it's formatted a little differently. It looks major, and then the minor is down here at the bottom. Just additional information for that specific customer is what that looks like. Okay, so that's the first step. Form-only fields. We're going to need two of them if we want to display two lines of information in the list form. Now notice that they also have a third form-only field. Third form-only field here is this image field. And notice it's a little different. It's defined as a phantom form field. Now if you remember, phantom fields or phantom widgets are used so that you can define a form field but not have it displayed in the form. That seems a bit contradictory, right? Because we want to show an image in the list, that clock image that we saw in the screenshot on the previous page, but we don't actually display the image directly from this image form field. It's just being used to hold the value of the image that needs to be displayed. The actual image is displayed by the major field here, so it's displayed along with that. It's optional, right? You don't have to display an image, but if you wish to display an image, you typically bind it to this major form-only field, major edit field. And then you're ready at that point, once you have your form fields defined and your record defined, you're ready to add your custom code. All right, so you're going to add some custom code in this case to concatenate some information together so that you can show the customer name information along with, it looked like a job code in that previous screen, so that has to be done. And then in the minor field as well, there's some computations and concatenation to be done there to show additional information. Now before we look at any more detail, it will probably help all of us to go back and look at this to see exactly what it looks like when you run the application. So we'll do that before we get into the actual computational part of the custom code. But one more thing to look at before we go. I almost forgot this part. A minute ago I said you have to bind that image column with the major field. If you want that image to be displayed with that first line of information, you look at the major properties, right, in your property view, and then you look for the image column property. And then this is where you specify the name of the form-only form field that you have defined to hold the value of the image you want to show. That sounds much more complicated, I think, than it really is. When we look at the example, I think you'll find it to be a lot easier than all this setup makes it appear. So all we've done here is just define a phantom field, and the only purpose for that phantom field is to hold the image value or the name of the image that you want to be displayed, but it doesn't actually display it. Instead, you take your form field, like your major or minor that you want to use to display the image, and you bind that image field to it with this image column property. So now we're ready to locate the point and add custom code. So this is probably a good place to go back and just look at it right there inside Genero Studio. But just before we do, let me just point out this one more thing here. So here we are. This is the computed fields code link that we talked about just a few minutes ago. And that computed fields code link is especially designed just to put you in there to customize a two-column list. So it's a very handy code link. It'll put you right exactly in the right point to do that. So now let's go back and take a look at the actual code and see what the application looks like running, just to give ourselves a review before we look at the code. It makes it easier to understand. So here's our Pool Doctors app. Let's just run it. Have to wake it up first here. All right, let's execute it and see what we're talking about there. So here's the list form. This is our job header list form that we were just looking at screenshots for. And you can see here, here's all of our images that are displayed. And notice we're going to have some custom code to determine which image to display. Because notice for jobs that aren't yet started, we have this image, right? The one that looks like a, I won't say an empty clock, but there's no blue in it, right? There's no time yet associated with the job. And then for jobs that are complete, like this one up here at the top, the clock image is completely filled in to show that it's complete, the job's done. And then for jobs that are in process, they're started but they're not yet complete, you can see we have this other image here where we've got some time associated with the job, but it's not fully filled in. So we have 3 different clock images there that we want to have displayed based on the status of the job. So of course that's going to require some custom code. We have the major up here at the top. This I'm going to pick one that I can pronounce better. Franklin Pool and Leisure up here. So there's our line of major information, the first column of information. And then down here in our minor column, we've got this text for job and then the job code. Now notice with this application, if you select the menu options, you have a detail option. And if you select detail, you have a choice between job code and job created. So right now the default display back here behind it is the job code display. But if I click on the job created, notice that that's a toggle and it switches so that this minor column display changes from the job code to the date and time. Job created 3/7/2014 at 4 o'clock. So that also is going to require some custom code. So just to quickly review so that when we see the custom code it will make more sense. All right, so I'm going to try minimizing that so that if we need to take a peek at it again we can. So let's see about finding that. That was the first thing we talked about, is there's some really nice code links that we can use to quickly find the right place in the code to customize a 2-column list. So since I don't have any of the forms up right now, let's pop over here into our BA diagram and find it. There's job header list. I'm just going to open that up so that the forms open. This particular code link, a lot of them are in the Records tab, and this one is when you select the record itself. I'm going to scroll over here where you can see it, and scroll down to the bottom. I should see a bunch of code links. So there they are down at the bottom, all the record-specific code links. So I mentioned earlier, or we saw earlier, that there's a special computed fields code link. So let's go ahead and select that, and that should put us directly into the correct module. So up here at the top, let's see what that is. Pool Doctors, job header list UI data. All right, so this is the job header list UI data module. And notice the point here is highlighted, this fct.scr_compute_fields.user point. So that's the point that you need to use to customize your 2-column list. And happily that code link will take you directly to it. There's a long string of custom code here, so I'm going to stretch this way out so you can see it better. Almost had it. All right, well, we'll still have to scroll some, it looks like. Okay, so here's our point. And here's a defined variable. I'm just going to pop right up there for a second. Define LREC BR computed fields. And, oh, that's a user type. Or that's a variable that's using a user type SCR_BR_FO type. Kind of a long name. So basically a user type defining a big record for us there. So that's already defined for us to use in this point. So the first line of custom code here is they're associating, they're doing the computations for the major field. They're using that SFMT operator that we talked about, I think, earlier last week to format what this display is going to look like. So here major is going to be, looks like two different parameters are being formatted here. This %1 is just a placeholder for the SFMT operator. So it's referring to this first parameter here, this pbrfields.customerCMName. So that's the first thing we're going to display, or first thing we're saving to this major variable, major member variable. And in the second parameter, the %2 over here is this one here, this pbrfields.jobHeader_JHCustomer, and then they're using the clipped keyword to clip off any trailing blanks for that, tidy it up. Notice also they've got parentheses around the %2, which tells us they want it formatted with parentheses. So the second parameter should be in parentheses. First parameter is not. So that's the formatting and the concatenation, if you will, of the first two fields there, and they're going to display all of those in one line in our list form in the major field. So that's how we pop this back up here. That's how we get this. Oops, I knew I would do that sooner or later. Here it is right here, Franklin Pool and Leisure. See if we can put it right here. Not quite. So that's our customer_CMName. And then we're concatenating that or formatting it with this job header JHCustomer. So there's our customer code or customer number right next to that. So that's our top line of information there in our list. And then notice we don't just have a minor statement here to assign the minor value. Instead, we've got a case statement. So here's part of our custom code so that we can customize the display for that minor column in the list by determining whether or not the user has selected job code or job created in that detail menu that we saw pop up. So it's keeping track of that with a variable called mtoggle. So if the user is using the default or job code, then this is the computation for the minor field to be displayed. Notice here's that text job : and then concatenated with that will be this pbrfields job header JH code. So there's the job code. But if the user goes into that detail menu option and selects job created, it's going to format it differently. This time with job created, a colon, and then we're getting the job header JH job created, and then also going to concatenate that or append the time here. I have to get out of my highlighter to show you that part. There we go. So they're picking another column of information. They're using the date and time operators to pull out just the date from this date time value, JH date created, and over here they're using the time operator to pull out just the time from a date time value that's stored in the database. So there they've got the formatting, and they've used a case statement to adjust the formatting based on whether or not the user has selected the job code option in that detail menu or the job created option. And then finally, down here at the bottom of the case statement, right after the case statement, we wanted to display an image. So down here at the bottom, they're saying, okay, the image field value is going to be the results of a function, the status to image, and I'm going to pass that function the JH status value, right, the job status essentially. So let's take a look at that. We have to go down to our user functions to find that status to image function, but we're pretty much there anyway. We're almost to the bottom of the module. So here's the function that they've used. This is a private function. We've been looking at a lot of public functions, but this one is private, so it can only be used inside this module. Here they're defining a variable, s, char1. They've passed in, remember, the job status information when they called the function, so it's defined here as s. And then they have a case statement, and they're just going through and looking at the value of this job status value that they've passed in. And if it's O, then they're going to use the clock 1 image. If it's I, which I'm assuming I means it's started but not finished, then we're going to use the clock 2 image. And if the value passed in is X, then we're using the clock 3 image. And they have that defined for both GMI and GMA. So they went through the case statement blocks for each one of those. So essentially that's all they're doing to set a value to the image field, and then that's all they have to do to display the image, because remember, in the form, in the properties, that image field is bound to the major form field. So it will take care of actually displaying that clock image. All we have to do in the custom code is set the image name, clock 1, clock 2, or clock 3. Okay. The only thing I can think of that might also be interesting to you here is if I go look, these images, you have a special directory here in your directory structure, your project directory structure, where you can keep all your images. So if we were to look in here, we should be able to find these clock images. And there's a bunch of them. But he was just using clock 1. There we go. It's not very exciting to look at, but you can open these and take a look at them. So that's where it's getting those images. It's getting them right there in our project directory structure, and you have a special location for your image files. Okay. Any questions about that? That's kind of a lengthy example to go through, so I'm not sure if everybody's with me. It takes a bit of practice, so one of the things you'll do in your lab this afternoon is you have a lab like this where you'll go in and create your form fields, form-only form fields like they've done, this major and minor form fields. You'll use some custom code in there to assign values to those form fields and display them. It won't be as exciting as this example because we don't have an image. However, there's nothing to keep you from going a little further in the lab if you want to, and you can go out there and pick an image. You can just pick a random image out there. You could use the clock image if you wanted to, and just go out there and add an image to your job note list form if you want to when you do the lab. That would give you some practice at doing that. You can always add on to these exercises if you want to. All right, well, I don't see any questions, so I'm going to go ahead and let's see what comes up next. Trying to determine whether we should go ahead and take a break here, or I think we're really close enough to being finished today. It's a fairly short chapter. I think I'm just going to push on, and I think we can go ahead and finish this probably in another 10 or 15 minutes. So let's see if we can get by without the break today, and that way you can go ahead and start on your labs this afternoon. So the next section here is on display array attributes and double-click. So if you remember what double-click was from last week, we talked about double-click and being able to set that property for the form at the table level. So we went in and assigned a double-click action, essentially, to the table. So that's what we're seeing here, is what we used last week to be able to define a double-click action. And the whole idea for that was so that the user could just tap on a row to have it displayed, right, to view it. So that worked perfectly fine for us in our for our job notes last week to be able to do that. So right up here, I've added to that. You can do it one way or the other, so I could do it right here at the table level, or right here is my display array. So in my custom code, and again there's a handy dandy code link for this that'll pop you right into the correct place. Another way to do it is by using display array attributes. So specifically there's an attribute called DoubleClick, and you just assign an action to DoubleClick, and that will be the action associated with the tap, right? So if a user taps on a row, that triggers this DoubleClick attribute, and then it will take whatever action or trigger whatever action you've associated with it. In this case, view, right? The view action. So that's the way you do it with custom code. And you can see there's not a lot of custom code involved here. It's just simply setting an attribute for this one. Now the point I mentioned earlier is a very handy one. It's very easy to find and very easy to use. It's just display attributes. So it literally puts you right there in the right module, function, and point for that display array. So there it is, display array, and then right inside that display array block is this point that has a place where you can put your attributes and specify your DoubleClick in this case. Now, row configuration on iOS devices is referring to row decoration specifically. For iOS devices, you can use the accessory type attribute, and you put it in the very same place, and you can use the very same code link, the one for display array attributes. So this goes really well with the DoubleClick, so I put them side by side. So the accessory type attribute can be checkmark, detail button, or disclosure indicator. So the screenshot that I've shown you is the check mark. Grab my highlighter here. So that's what it looks like when a user sees the form with this check mark indicator. The current row there has the check mark on it. But you can choose between check mark, detail button, which is, I believe, if I remember right, the little eye inside of a circle, I think, for the detail button that tells you that there's more information if you push the button, and then the disclosure indicator, the little redirectional arrow. So those are just iOS specific, right? Those don't have any effect for Android. And then hiding or showing an action, we've got this action state code link that you can use that puts you right in the point. And this is a record level code link as well. I think all of the ones we've looked at right here have been record level code links. But you're right inside the point where you can go in and define your action states. Now again, this doesn't need to be something that you commonly do. You may never do it. But it does give you an opportunity to go in at kind of a lower level if you want to and actually manipulate the state of these actions. So for any mode, you can go in and customize which actions are hidden or shown. So notice this one, call p dialog set action hidden. So apparently there's a print action, and they don't want that print action to show at all here. So print action or set action hidden is going to be set to true. Now that's different from just disabling an action, by the way. If you disable an action, which again the code does that for us most of the time, the generated code, but if we wanted to, we could go in and disable an action. The action is still visible, you can see it, it's just grayed out, right? It's disabled so that it can't be selected. But when you say set action hidden, like we see here, you don't see the print action at all. It's like it's not even there. So there is a big difference between hidden and disabled. So there's a special code link just for that. Here's speaking of enable and disabling actions, here's the custom code to do that. So they've gone into a special point here in a dialog, before dialog statement. There's a point that allows you to do that before the user starts the dialog. And they've gone in and they've set action active exit, so the exit action to false. So that means it's not active. And then they've even hidden it. So it's essentially disabled, right? Set action active, false means it's not active, so it's disabled. That would make it grayed out if that's all that we had there. But we also have the set action hidden as well, that statement, and that's set to true. So that doesn't just disable it, it actually hides it. So the user in this case can't even see that exit button or that exit option in the menu, whatever it happens to be. And then row bound. We talked about row bounding. I don't know if that's a real word or not, but we'll use it. We talked about row bounding an action with properties, which we learned to do last week, but you can also row bound a custom action in custom code if you like. So here's this print option again that's not a standard action with generated code, but we can add it here. They've got an on action print, and here in the attributes they're specifying this row bound attribute for this particular action. So again, now the user, that's kind of like the delete option where we're able just to swipe to trigger the action. Now they can do that here with this row bound action. They see it attached to the row essentially. Okay. So that kind of gets us through all of the slides. Let me just pop through here and see if there's anything else that I'd like to show you in the code itself for some of these. All right. Well, I think we've probably seen most of those. Okay, we'll go ahead and call it good, I think, for today. One thing I might do is if you have any comments or questions about the lab this afternoon, I may show some demos tomorrow if I have any particular issues that come up with the lab or anything of that nature, and go in and show them to you tomorrow. So we had a short day presentation-wise today, just a few minutes over an hour, so we didn't take a break today. I think we made it just fine without one. Let's go through the lab. Get rid of this. We don't want to look at images anymore. Let me pop up the lab here. Okay, here we go. Okay, so I mentioned earlier that this one is a longer lab. I think it's 15 pages, which I'm not sure if that's the longest lab you've had this week, but it's probably getting on up there if it's not the longest. But I think there's a lot of interesting things in this lab. I think you'll enjoy it. Hope you do. The first part here is custom code example. You're going to explore form and record changes to customize the two-column list. Now that's exactly the same thing that we just did in our presentation today in our lecture. I went through and showed you all the changes that were made to customize, what was it, the job header list form. So this is just the same thing. In fact, it is the job header list form. So that would be a repetition of what we did in our lecture part of the class today, but it would probably still be good practice for you unless you just feel like you really have it down. If you do, you can skip that part and you can just go right on down to the next exercise, which is customizing a two-column layout for your job note list form. So this is a form we've been working with all of last week and this week as well. So we're going to customize that so that we can create these form-only fields, the major and minor fields, just like the example we saw with job header list. So that goes on for 2 or 3 pages. And then exercise 4, I probably will demonstrate this tomorrow because I kind of forgot this was in here. This is the custom code to display a note count in job header grid. So if you've noticed, when you've gone into the job note list form by selecting the notes option here, the notes button from this job header grid form, there was nothing in there that told you how many notes. All these other detail lines here had like 1 parts, 0 photos, 1 timesheet line, but your notes display doesn't have that. So that's what this exercise is going to be all about, is adding custom code to display a note count in the job header grid. So that's several pages of step-by-step. I don't think it's all that complicated, but a lot of explanation here on what you're doing, so that takes up some space. So what you're really doing is going and reviewing all of the custom code that's already there for photos and timesheets and detail lines. And you're essentially just going to imitate that for your notes, for your job note list form. So that's what we're doing here. And in exercise 5, we're going to add the code to pre-populate key values for your job note grid form. Something else you'll notice is that typically when a user goes in add mode to add new information, he shouldn't be required to enter in primary key values. So for job note, our job note table, our primary key is a composite key. It's made up of the job code and then an index or a line number keeping track of the number of notes for that particular job. So instead of the user being required to enter that information, you can go in and add some custom code to do it for them. So that's what exercise 5 does. Learn how to do that so that you won't have to have your users try to enter in primary key values. The problem with letting users do that or asking them to do that is sometimes users don't know the proper job code or what line number they're on, and it would be easy for them to make a mistake. So that's something that's much better customized for them, right, or creating those default values for them. So that's what this particular exercise has you do. And I believe that is the last exercise. Let's make sure here at the bottom. Yeah, okay.